لا يزال الخير حيا لا يزال إن في الدنيا سلاما وظلال أخبر الأيام أنها في وصال قم بنا.
We've lived in a society for decades, well since its inception. I believe Australia would be the same in the US, where our morality pretty much coincided with the morality of the society. That homosexuality wasn't acceptable in larger society. So we didn't, as Muslims, have to discuss this particular issue because it coincided with what everyone else believed as well. So I just wanted to point that out. The only other thing that I'd like to say before we start the discussion is that when talking about homosexuality, there's a few different aspects that we are concerned with. So we can talk about simply someone having same-sex desire. How does the individual deal with that? How do the people around them deal with that? Then there is the behavior itself. Then there are people who are practicing, so even the behavior that's split into two, people who are practicing it but are regretful of doing so, people who are practicing it and are not regretful of doing so. Then there are those who have that desire, practicing that behavior, are not regretful, and are promoting that behavior. And these are all different levels, and they require a bit of a different discussion, inshallah ta'ala, that hopefully we'll be able to talk about.
Can I have Jalaluddin?
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So first of all, when speaking about this topic, I'd actually like to retitle it as speaking about Muslims with same-sex attraction, because I think that it's very important that, you know, we're careful with the language that we're using when speaking about this topic, that, you know, we don't actually lump everyone together and not distinguish between someone who's, you know, struggling with these feelings from those who openly promote and, you know, encouraging homosexuality as a lifestyle. Because, you know, many of the brothers and sisters that are actually dealing with this issue are not actually, you know, they're struggling and they're trying very hard, you know, not to fall into the act of homosexuality. So what they're really struggling with right now is just same-sex attraction. And as we know, labels do affect the way you perceive yourself. Okay, the labels you give to people do, you know, they do affect the way that, you know, the identity that the way we feel about ourselves, and also the way we feel about others. So that's why I think that it's very important that we, you know, we make our brothers and sisters still feel part of our Muslim community, rather than to use language and labels that potentially, you know, pushes them further towards the edge and makes them feel even more vulnerable and alienated than many of them already do. Okay, so I just want to begin by talking about some of the misconceptions surrounding this topic, and some of the struggles that are actually being faced by some of these sisters and brothers. The first misconception is you think that it's someone not very practicing that's falling into this, but the reality is there are actually some very religious, you know, multazim brothers and sisters who are actually struggling with this issue. The second you know, misconception is people think it's a choice they're making. Like, that could be true for some people, but for many people it's not a choice. It's something like, it's a very compelling, let's say, attraction that they feel, and they're not having control over it. And let me tell you that some of them have spent maybe 10 years making dua, asking Allah to take it away. And, you know, it's not going away, subhanAllah. So it's very hard. They struggle with a great deal of guilt, a great deal of self-hate. Okay? So the thing is, I just want you to also try to understand from their point of view the type of pressures that they're going through. Like, can you imagine that, you know, you've got this same-sex attraction, and then you know that as Muslims we mix in same-sex environments. Females tend to mix with females, males mix with males, and it's quite taboo to kind of mix, you know, intergender is quite taboo to mix with each other, you know. So what happens is, like, obviously, you know, you make friends with people, but then sometimes it could happen that you could start feeling attracted to them, and then because of the guilt they feel, they might break relations with those people because they feel guilty the fact that they've actually started to have some feelings, towards that, that brother or that sister. And then, as you know, we tend to be quite, we give each other hugs and stuff like that. So you can imagine that, we have quite close contact with each other as brothers and sisters in Islam. Then the other thing is too that, most of you come from most of you are second generation Muslims here in Australia, and you know how that those parents from overseas try to always push you to get married. So imagine being a person with same-sex attraction and your parents are, why aren't you married yet? Why aren't you married yet? And, you're really worried because you don't even feel attracted to, for example, women, or you don't feel attracted to men, and parents are putting pressure on you to try to get married, And the other thing is too that we know how the cultural reaction of many parents are. Like, how do you even discuss this with your parents? Like, where are they going to place you? How are they going to react? Like, you haven't even done anything to act upon these desires, but yet you're going to be, in most cases, as we know the way that, homosexuality is spoken about in the community, they're very highly judged, despite they actually haven't acted upon anything, but they feel like they're made to feel like, basically, like most people will say, oh, they're just some sick, perverted people or something like that. But like I said, they're not actually in control of how they feel. So, just to finish off, I'm sorry I'm taking up a lot of time, but I just want to really get this point through. The other problem is the double whammy dealing with this issue in our community is that no one can really come out and talk about it. Like, psychologists can't even sit on this panel basically because they would be like, this could be, because it's, because of, the political environment we live in, that if they were to talk about it, this could be damaging towards their careers, for example. As you know, like very often one of the religious leaders, if we say certain, things, we find it's in the newspaper, it goes in Sunday things like that. So, it's very hard for us to have open conversations in our community about these things. And the problem is with all this pressure that they're feeling is that some of them can just get to the point where they just want to give up, because where's their support? Where's their support supposed to come from? The other thing I need you to all understand as well, that a lot of these people have gone through quite severe, maybe sexual abuse or, family violence as children, and this makes them even more vulnerable. Like, they've got very low self-esteem issues, they could be dealing with mental health issues as well, and then you have got no support in the community, subhanAllah. So the result of all of this, and it is a very, thing we need to really think about a lot more, and that is that the result of this is that some of them, in extreme cases, unfortunately, would, obviously, consider suicide, things like this. Many of them would think just to leave the community, just go and act upon their, they just give up and go and act on their feelings. Others could leave Islam, and you've got to remember, always keep this in your mind, the LGBT community will be there waiting for them with their hands open. So if we're not trying to make our brothers and sisters feel welcome, we really, run the risk of pushing them into other areas where we don't want them to go, inshallah. So I'll just leave it there.
And that's a very interesting, just to elaborate on Jamaluddin's point about I like the point about not, kind of the balance between accepting them without supporting their lifestyle in terms of the religious views. And like you said, the LGBT community will be waiting for them if we do push them outside the Muslim community, because in Islam we're meant to be a very accepting religion, very accepting community, and definitely that's a very important point to make. I'm just going to pass it on to Brother Mohammed.
Start with dua. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma ameen. I begin with the critical acknowledgement that we're speaking and indeed living on stolen land. And I don't say this lightly or as a gesture. We're essentially occupying a house that is not ours, that we've not been welcomed into, and we should never underestimate the violation that our presence embodies, both to the occupiers, both to the dignity of the homeowners and to our own self-respect as trespassers. I'd like to also pass on my appreciation and thanks towards the organisers for considering me and inviting me to this important event. Some of you will know that I myself tried to organise a similar panel a couple of years back, which we had to cancel, unfortunately, due to being unable to find a religious scholar willing or able to speak on the topic. So Alhamdulillah, although the discussion, I agree with my co-panelists that it's not where it needs to be, but alhamdulillah, I think we're in a better space than we were a couple of years ago, and these events are quite important, and these topics in particular, the difficult ones. So I take my hat off to the MSAs for coming together to put on a discussion like this that is quite risky to their reputation. So jazakumullah khair. I will also, only because I didn't hear it and I may have missed it, but I think it's important that there's a content and trigger warning. Some of the topics we're discussing are quite heavy, and as the sister mentioned, suicidal ideations and whatnot. So it's important that that's put out there. They will be heavy topics. Mine will be pretty heavy. So if anybody feels uncomfortable, please feel perfectly fine to get up and leave and seek help by the organisers if need be. So I'm going to be honest and say that I find this a really difficult topic. It's one that I've been pondering on for many years. I've had my own fluctuating opinions over those many years. I've witnessed all manner of public discussions on the topic in the debates that we have. I've studied the topic academically. I've learned and taught people from the impacted communities, both Muslim and non-Muslim. And I've also had people entrust me with their coming out. I'm no expert on the topic, but at best I can say I've had a broad exposure that has allowed me to recognize some of the gaps in the ways that we engage this topic as a community. More specifically, I've come to recognize how our particular focus on certain areas to the exclusion of others not only hinders our ability to seriously address those tensions and honestly discuss them, but also causes, most importantly for me, untold damage that I think we would be quite devastated to learn that we're often contributing to. I'm also, again, to be perfectly honest, I'm conscious of the fact that my opinions can sometimes be quite divisive. It's not something that I celebrate, to be honest. In a world where, obviously as we all experience, some people want us dead simply for existing. The last thing I want to be doing is contributing to that disunity and disharmony. At the same time, I do believe, however, that sometimes growth is painful and it's necessary, and there's no escaping that fact. Sometimes we need to uncover these deep wounds in order to treat them properly, and I really think we're past the stage of just applying band-aid solutions to the problems that we're facing as a community as we mature and grow and become more comfortable. So how do we approach this sensitive topic? The community discussions I've witnessed over the years around this topic are usually framed in legal terms. For example, what is the ruling on this particular act or set of acts? How many genders or sexualities does the Islamic law recognize? When we do venture into other areas, they usually mimic the more binary talking points of the society that we live in. Gay or straight, nature or nurture, femininity or masculinity, hate the sin or the sinner. It's therefore a difficult topic to approach and do justice to. Much like the subject of terrorism, which I used to teach, there's so much baggage that's pre-imposed onto the discourse before we even begin speaking that it's near impossible not to engage in a reactionary manner, always responding to one accusation or another, or a set of assumptions, and we're always unpacking these before we're even able to get to the crux of the issue. So also like terrorism, again, I put a lot of thought into this talk and I struggled with it, and I feel the only meaningful way to engage this topic is really to subvert it, to subvert the dominant talking points, and not engage in the dominant manner. So I was initially invited to have an academic discussion on sexuality because that's my background as an academic, and challenge some of the assumptions underpinning this discussion. And I will bring in some academic content. So for example, and I did consider writing the entire paper on this, for example, our obsession with questions of formal law is one that always concerns me. Far from being a return to our tradition where the law was only in fact codified after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the obsession with formal law is a very modern phenomenon, and particularly one born of a nation state with its need to govern decentralized populations. This is before we even get into more complex topics of the philosophy of law as embodiment, rather than abstract adjudication as we practice it today. Or how, for example, many of the categories we use in discussing sexuality are actually borrowed from Christianity, such as the idea of a sinful homosexual lifestyle, essentially speaking of homosexuality as a separate species. This is, again, quite a modern phenomenon. And again, it's before we start dissecting the very rigid and fixed notions of gender and sexuality that we've largely borrowed from a modern Christian tradition, as against the quite nuanced and complex discussions that belong to our traditions. Or, for example, how a practice of religion today, and this is what my thesis is on essentially, is largely secular, the way we practice our deen today, particularly the understandings that we, and I'm sorry to say this, deem traditional or conservative. For example, how we think of Islam as a set of beliefs that we carry around as individuals, rather than an embodied deen, essentially a way of life that's not separate from who we are. And again, this is before we delve into more complex theories of the representational relationship we have towards our Prophet ﷺ, as opposed to the symbiotic and embodied relationship that's part of our deen. I want to return to these points at some point, inshallah, but I really don't think it's where the discussion is at the moment. Where it is at within the community, I think it's in the very early stages, and given how much is at stake in this discussion, I feel it wouldn't be appropriate to take such an approach. I actually think it would be immoral and insensitive given to have a theoretical exercise in this forum, given what's at stake. Given that what's at stake is usually, as the sister mentioned, people's lives. So I don't feel that an abstract discussion of, comparing texts and comparing categories is actually appropriate. So instead, what I want to do is simply share a story with you. And I'll try and tie it into my studies on trauma and suffering, which I've spent a long time exploring, and I hope, inshallah, that it resonates and can bring out some talking points that will help us discuss this topic a bit more maturely, but also really critically make us analyze ourselves and our own actions. So for me, the crux of this debate is really not about legal rulings and classifications. It's not about the fiqh of sexual relations or identities. It's not about, physical punishments and judgments. Let's not kid ourselves. We don't live in an Islamic government where these things impact our day-to-day lives. We're past that. Okay, we lost that battle. Maybe, inshallah, one day we get it back, but that's not where we are. So we need to have the discussions that are actually relevant to our lives. And the discussion for me, I think that is essentially relevant for this topic, is a topic of oppression. And especially which side of the equation we fall on in the question of oppression. So I won't bore you with specifics, and again, apologies, it's going to get a little bit heavy here, but that's what the study of trauma is. But I'll tell you that without the specifics, in the course of my studies and also ongoing medical treatments and whatnot, I've uncovered that I myself have had a series of personal traumas growing up through childhood and carrying through, and along with that comes a list of destructive behaviors. So I want to talk you through that. I want to speak to what it feels like to live traumatized and oppressed, how that process comes about, how it functions, and what it does to a person, because I think it's quite relevant to this topic. And particularly I want to tell you that a lot of our behaviors towards queer Muslims, towards our brothers and sisters, are actually identical to those that cause and trigger trauma. So again, I'm going to get a little bit heavy and then come back, inshallah, but essentially we're intersubjective beings. What that means is our sense of self, who we are, is formed in direct relation to the people around us. Our formative years, particularly when we're young, are labeled as formative because that's when we form our sense of self. Okay, and language plays a huge role in this formation. Our sense of self is formed by reflecting off others around us. So we know the Prophet ﷺ told us that the believer is the mirror of their brother or their sister. So this is the process of self-formation. Now, if those reflections are damaged or distorted or broken, so is our sense of self. So is the forming of our identity is also broken. I want to be clear here. I'm not referring to some dramatic or deliberate process of destroying someone that's necessary to cause trauma. It doesn't have to be very complicated. It can be a single word, an off-the-cuff remark. It can be a passing statement, a glance, or a stare. It can be enough to send somebody on a spiral of self-destruction. When you consider the fact that trauma can be passed down through generations, I want us to think about the fact that a single unthought word that we utter could literally destroy generations of people. That's what we're talking about. That's why, for me, the topic of oppression is so relevant here. And we know, for example, the Prophet ﷺ taught us to be very careful over and over about what's between our lips, our tongue. Okay, and for that reason, he understood the heaviness of our words in our speech, because we really have no idea how impactful our words can be to those people around us. So the being misunderstood, misbelieved, misjudged, invalidated, belittled, mocked, or even outright abused or denied of who we are is actually the essence of trauma. And when we think about the community that we're talking about, that's how we treat them by and large. It's simply human nature to need the validation of others. It's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. And it's a condition of healthy living. So when that's denied, whether it's deliberate or otherwise, it can actually be impossible to carry on living. That's part of the reason people commit suicide. And even if they're strong enough to carry on, life in those circumstances can be quite excruciating. So I think of the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam when he left Hajar and Ismail in an unlivable desert. Okay, and pretty much by any logical standards, they're destined to die. He made dua for them. And what was the dua he made? He said, وَاجْعَلْ أَفْئِدَةً مِّنَ النَّاسِ تَهْوِي إِلَيْهِمْ وَارْزُقْهُمْ مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَشْكُرُونَ. The very first thing he asked for, bring the hearts of mankind towards them. Yeah, show them human connection, because he understood how important that was to survival. Okay, it's not some luxury that we have. And Ibrahim, of course, alayhi salam, was one of the ulul azm. He's one of the key anbiya that we have. So I want to, and again, apologies for the length, but I just want to take you very quickly through what it feels like to live that sort of life, because the life we're often subjecting our brothers and sisters to, without realizing, can be quite dramatic and quite painful. And I say this because I know we're a good community. We don't intentionally want to destroy people's lives. So I know that we don't know that we're causing this sort of pain, which is why I want to bring it up. What does it look like? It's an unbearable life of pain and isolation. It's a life of ongoing trust and abandonment issues. It's a life of self-harm by and large, self-sabotage, self-doubt, and very often the replication of toxic and abusive relationships. When we feel betrayed by the ones we love, the ones that are supposed to be family, like our community, like our ummah, we not only lose trust in those people, but we actually lose the ability to trust full stop. We don't know how to trust anymore because we've been violated so many times. Our brain then forms defensive mechanisms to protect us from that pain and that hurt that we've experienced, and we end up damaging ourselves. Sometimes the only way to survive a lack of trust is to block out our emotions, especially as vulnerable children who don't know how to set boundaries in a healthy or assertive manner. We end up just blocking. And of course, with the habitual nature of our brain, these practices just become habit. We carry them into adulthood, we pass them on to our children, and they continue and they continue. Now, I want to be very careful here, because when we think about blocking out emotions, I think we usually think of it in a childish manner of being sentimental and being overly sensitive. But it's actually quite literal. So we can't always block the sources of pain, the things that are causing us pain. So what we do is the next best thing. We block our ability to feel pain. Okay, and what that means is we switch off our receptors. And I'm talking quite literally our ability to feel, our ability to taste, to smell, to see, all of these things. These are our senses, these are our emotions. This is how we actually experience the world. So in reaction to trauma, we actually switch these off. So I want you to think about what sort of a life you live when you switch off your ability to experience the world. And I'll run you through a little bit of what that means. And so I'm going to flick through this because I realize I've written a lot more than I should have. But I do want to reflect on this for a moment. What does it feel like living without feeling? Of course, we don't know what we don't know. So I didn't know until I went through the process of healing, alhamdulillah, that majority of my life I couldn't actually feel. I had dumbed down my feelings as a result of that trauma. I'll run you through a few examples, but just skipping through because of time. Essentially, that blocking of the ability to feel and sense the world is what leads to self-harm. Okay, so I'll give you some examples from my own experience again, not for the shock factor, but to really help us appreciate what we are doing quite directly to our brothers and sisters. So in my own experience, for example, I've been self-harming for a long time without realizing. Okay, it's very difficult to say that. And self-harm is not what we usually think it is, about sitting there and slitting your wrists and saying, I want to kill myself. Some people do respond like that, but for the majority of the time, it's actually it's an intention, it's a want to feel life again. So for example, in my own case, I would drink boiling hot water as it was still boiling. So literally take it off the stove and scull it. Because anything else, I couldn't feel it. It would feel cold. Okay, it wasn't a deliberate attempt at harming, but anything else and I wouldn't actually feel it. Same goes with having really hot showers that would burn anybody else. I would have these showers and burn my skin but not feel it. Now, in my research on trauma, these behaviors are a result of blocking out that emotion and that sense of feeling that we have. So what we end up doing is we try and live life on the edge in order to experience life. The only way that we can experience life is to really live on the edge and put ourselves in harm's way. And this is the same case for people who take drugs, who get into abusive relationships, who fall into violent tendencies and whatnot. They're trying to actually experience life. And the reason they can't experience life in a meaningful manner is because they've been traumatized, and as a result of that trauma, they've blocked off their ability to feel. So again, I don't want to go through all of it because it is quite long, but I do want us to appreciate what it means to ostracize and alienate and deny our own brothers and sisters, what that could lead to, and the sort of life that we're setting up for them. Whether we mean to or not is not really the question here. If we're doing that as an act of oppression, we need to be concerned about ourselves in this position. And I say that because some of the other symptoms that I see now that I've gone through these processes, but also learnt quite a lot about it, the addictive behaviors that we see. So for example, addictions to drugs, to alcohol, to pornography, to people, to toxic behaviors, all of these can be symptoms of trauma, okay? So I'll wrap it up with this, inshallah. I didn't go through everything I wanted to, but essentially, I want us to think about this topic in terms of oppression, okay? Not in terms of exclusively the halal or haram, and it's not to underplay it. I want us to think about our position in this dynamic. Are we oppressing our own brothers and sisters? Okay, and I don't give this talk to garner sympathy, least of all for myself, not even for the communities we're talking about. If anybody needs sympathy, it's us. We know that the dua of the oppressed is mustajab. It's granted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine we're responsible for causing generations of trauma to people. They're not the ones who need the sympathy, we need the sympathy. So I'll wrap it up with that, inshallah. I just really wanted to draw attention to the effects of our language, because trauma is by and large a product of language. It's a product of self-denial, a denial of who people are, and that really affects their sense of self and can lead to a life of quite explicit hell. And again, I refer back, there's plenty of ayat that talk about the punishments of Jahannam as being drinking scalding hot water, having boiling water poured on you. These sorts of things are the conditions that we're actually creating in this world for our brothers and sisters. So I want us to consider that we don't need to warn them about Jahannam when they're living it in this world as a result of our actions. So I'll wrap it up with that. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Brother Mohammed. You touched on a lot of heavy topics, and it's very interesting to see you address it in a way from a trauma background. A lot of people, they see homosexuality as a dehumanizing thing. They distance them from themselves. I'm seeing from the conversations, maybe could it be as a defense mechanism of us versus them, not seeing them as, one, and it could be a product of trauma that people start to experience these feelings and they're not being addressed. So definitely touching on that, it's very important to understand that these are all just byproducts of mental health related issues that stem from just simply the way people address the conversations that are being had. And I just want to go to Nuruddin. I wanted to ask the question, on a broad level, just to move it away from mental health and more into the community, how does the Muslim community treat those with same-sex attraction, and what have the impacts of this treatment been?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think it's an issue that we've largely ignored because we haven't had to pay attention to, right? This is a very new issue, and so I think we've largely ignored people who have those feelings and ignored even the existence of it in our communities. What is the effect of that? I think that Brother Muhammad spoke to that a lot better than I can, of what is the effect of being ignored in the community. I do just want to say that, and it's a difficult balance, and it's why Islamic scholars and psychologists and all different types of people have to work together, because I understand what you're saying, that we don't want to solely focus on the law, and we have become a law-obsessed people, but we do want to know what the law is, and even though we're not in an Islamic society, we want to know what the punishment is, just to know the severity of the sin. We don't want this to be something that we're taking lightly, while we also then turn to psychologists or people who work with in trauma and ask, well, how exactly do we deliver that message? I think that balance is important.
So, very interesting that you say that point. I just wanted to also ask, how does one deal with the cultural phenomenon and its normalization? If Jamal would like to...
Actually, if you don't mind, I just want to, because I think it's very important that we get some more clear guidelines on how to deal with our brothers and sisters going through same-sex attraction. And I do believe that Islam, looking at, we have got the guidelines. If we're always, Allah Ta'ala tells us that whenever you're confused about issues, you turn back to the guidance of the Quran and Sunnah, right? So I just want to go through here and put this into perspective in regards to the layout that fiqh would, define this, so that we can understand, so that we're not, overreacting in regards to people's different levels in relation to this particular issue, right? So, so the thing is, you've got the first, I sort of divide this into 4 categories. So, the first category are basically those who are, and this is very important if there's anyone in this room who's actually suffering with same-sex attraction. This is such an important thing to understand, so that you don't have so much self-hate and so much anxiety through what you're experiencing, and so much guilt. Held to account for that. In fact, there's a hadith in Al-Bukhari and Muslim in which the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَجَاوَزَ لِأُمَّتِي عَمَّا وَسْوَسَتْ أَوْ حَدَثَتْ بِهِ أَنفُسَهَا مَا لَمْ تَعْمَلْ بِهِ أَوْ تَكَلَّمْ. So Allah Ta'ala has, overlooked for my ummah that which, whispers to themselves, or, things that come to them whispering to themselves, or, they self-talk, as long as they don't act upon that or speak about it, right? So, and the other thing that, another narration which I think is very important for us to hear about is, there was a time when some of the companions came to the Prophet ﷺ and they basically said, Ya Rasulullah, we have these thoughts that come to our minds that are so, they're so great that we can't even speak about it. Like it's on such a, level that we can't even say it with our mouths, And he said to them, look what he says. He goes, ذَاكَ صَرِيحُ الْإِيمَانِ. The fact that you're worried about having those thoughts, feeling guilty for having those thoughts, shows you a sign that you have Iman in your heart. Because had you not had Iman in your heart, you wouldn't feel anything. You wouldn't be bothered about it. You say, well, that's, do you understand? So I just want you to I really think it's important that people can detach the guilt from this action, and also for us to realize that don't judge these people due to this same-sex attraction because they don't have control over it. And so if they're not even held to account, why are we holding them to account? That's one thing. Then the second category is we might have someone who takes it a step further, where, they purposely look on purpose, and they might purposely think about things. They might even do some actions which are below the actual act itself, right? Now, let's not throw the first stone, so to speak, because we know that even heterosexuals, they fall into this category themselves. Who can put their hand up in this room and say they never looked on purpose at the opposite gender, or they, you understand, we all could fall into this, right? So we have to realize that the Prophet ﷺ told us that every son of Adam will have their share of zina. And zina doesn't mean necessarily that you fall into the actual act of zina, but there are steps that lead to zina. So from that, he said, for example, that for the zina of the ayn, the zina of the eye is looking. So if you look on purpose with lust, that's a type of zina. It's not a major sin, but it's a it comes under a minor sin that you need to ask Allah Ta'ala to forgive you. But what does the Prophet say? Kulu bani Adam khata. All bani Adam are sinners, and the best of the sinners are those who make tawbah. You understand? So we're not gonna self-hate because we happen to do this, right? We just have to get back up, pull ourselves back up, and make our tawbah and keep going, right? Then we come to the third category, which are those who may fall into this sin. They may actually go to that level of falling into this sin, but they do it in private, okay? So obviously doing that is definitely going to have an effect on a person's spirituality, right? Spirituality and principles and morals. It's going to have an effect on you. You can't say that you're going to do anything that Allah and His Messenger has forbidden. It's going to have an effect on you. You can't deny that, right? But what we have to put into perspective here is it does not take a person out of Islam. All right? It does not take a person out of Islam. So we shouldn't be dealing with them, had we found out, we shouldn't be dealing with them as a disbeliever, right? So it's just keep in mind that it is possible for a Muslim to fall into major sins. And this is something that the Ahlul Sunnah are, there is a consensus amongst Ahlul Sunnah that major sins do not take a person out of Islam. All right, they don't take them out of the Muslim community. But like I said, we should still not underestimate the destruction that will be on a person's iman due to engaging in major sins. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "La yazni zani hina yazni wa huwa mu'min." Right. So when a person engages in zina, he's not considered to be like the iman. He's not considered at the level of being a mu'min. If he did that, at the time of doing that, he's not considered to be on the level of a mu'min, right? He can still be a Muslim, but he won't be mu'min. And in another narration, which is a good reminder to everybody, because, a good reminder is that when someone does a major sin like this, actually what happens, as mentioned in another narration, is that the iman actually comes out of them and flutters like a cloud above them, subhanAllah. And then until they finish the act, and then it comes back. But the danger you have to really understand here is that engaging in any major sin, when you do this, what can happen, the danger of it, is that you can start to normalize it. Like the more you engage in any type of sin, the more you become to normalize it until you no longer hate that sin, and that's how Iman can slowly be removed from the heart. So I think it's important to put things into perspective. But let's also say here that for any Muslim that does major sins, even if they didn't repent, like inshallah they repent, and the doors of repentance are always open, as you know, until you know, basically the soul is leaving from your body. But even if they didn't repent, that we know that it's up, when they meet with Allah, it's up to Allah, right? That it's up to Him whether, you know, what is their fate, basically. But we do know that ultimately, even if they died with a major sin like this, that they will still enter Jannah, ultimately, right? And that's based on a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man qala la ilaha illallah dakhala al-jannah wa in zana wa in saraq." Like, even if they did a major sin, right, and they didn't repent from it, they will still enter Jannah as long as they said la ilaha illallah, right? So keep that in mind. And I'm sorry I'm taking up so much time, but I just felt it's very important because I see how much we're putting everyone in the same, you know, in the same bracket, basically. And then lastly, we have the ones that they basically openly promote, you know, homosexuality as a lifestyle. Like they openly, you know, speak about their sins to others. And like we're going to say it, you know, we're going to say it honestly, and that is that we're not being homophobic when we say that we can't accept anyone trying to normalize the homosexual lifestyle in the Muslim community, just as we would not accept for any Muslims to try to promote like adultery between married couples as being acceptable. Like, you know, you've got people now, in this society where they do, you know, swinging between married couples and stuff like that. I'm not talking about our community, but do you understand? So if someone was to come out and say, oh, this is okay to do this in Islam, we're going to have the same reaction towards them, right? And look at what Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يُحِبُّونَ أَن تَشِيعَ الْفَاحِشَةُ فِي الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. Those who love to spread al-fahisha, they love to spread al-fahisha amongst the believers. You know, they're threatened. Allah Ta'ala threatens them because this is where we draw the line, that we can't accept people to come and encroach on the Muslim community and try to, you know, spread al-fahisha. So, and then, you know, the Messenger of Allah also tells us that كُلُّ أُمَّتِي مُعَافًا إِلَّا الْمُجَاهِدِينَ. All of my ummah are forgiven except for those who openly go out boasting about their sins, you know, openly, you know, trying to encourage others towards that. So, and we know that, you know, you'll take a share in anyone that you share in the sin of anyone that you encouraged towards, you know, something that's considered to be a munkar. So I think that I'm hoping that by what I've said, I know that I took a bit of time, but what I wanted to say was I just thought it was very important because we need to be able to put this issue into perspective and have clear guidelines, you know, in respect of how we deal with our brothers and sisters and, you know, where they fall in regards to this. Okay, sisters and brothers? Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khair. So we have about 2 minutes to wrap up on this very, very taboo topic, and if we had many more opportunities to address this, it would be ideal. But just to kind of wrap it up, I know as a young person, I have a lot of friends who are Muslim and homosexual, but they try more same-sex attraction. So it's a phenomenon that's growing in the Muslim community, and as a young person and people that are in the MSAs who people disclose that information to them, how does us as a young person address that, and how do we go about creating a framework in the community that we're able to know exactly how to address other people with same-sex attraction without criminalizing them and creating an us-them dynamic? Yeah.
I'll try and keep it quick, just following on what you said, sister. Appreciate what you've said. Obviously, you know, we've been across this sort of discussion for quite a long time in the community. I'm going to put it straight out there. I don't sugarcoat very much. I think, despite it being, you know, obviously part of the tradition, I think it's problematic to enter the discussion at that point. And I'm not putting that on you. That's where the discourse is at. if we take a step back and look at the context that we're in at the moment, you've acknowledged it yourself, I spoke about it, we've ostracized that community. I think we can all acknowledge that. We've ostracized them, they're not really allowed in the mosques. The fact that they're not on the panel and they're not allowed to be on the panel is evidence of that. So the entry point for me in this discussion is not the legal categorization. The entry point needs to be, firstly, a recognition of their humanity, that they are brothers and sisters, that they're humans. وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, they're human and they have a human dignity which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them. We are not in a position to take that away from them. When we talk about people in a strictly legal sense as categories of a legal discourse, it's dehumanizing if we haven't first recognized them as people. That's my contention. But also, and again, like particularly as women and also as Muslims who experience this in the world that we live in, we know what it's like to be discussed purely as a problem. Okay, we're discussed as Muslims as a problem of terrorism. We know how that feels. So it's really unfair. We're doing the exact same thing back to our brothers and sisters. Imagine being discussed in relation only to your sin, or even not even your sin, a thought that you have or a tendency that you have. That's your entire identity. That's how we're discussing these people. This is what my problem is. So again, my problem is not with the film. My problem is with the framework, as you mentioned, within which we're having this conversation, is literally, these people are a problem. How do we deal with this problem? Now, everybody in the crowd, I put this on all of you, put your hand up if you're not a sinner. Please put your hand up if you're not a sinner, and I'll call you a liar to your face. Yeah, we're all sinners. كُلُّ بَنِي آدَمَ خَطَّاءٌ. It's by definition. We don't talk to each other as sinners, and we ought not to talk to any other of our brothers and sisters as sinners. For me, this is really the base of where we're having this discussion. To be honest, perfectly honest, we're at the very, very beginning. We're not even at the legal stage yet. Where, as a community, we're mature enough to have those discussions. So again, it's no criticism of you, but as a community, we need to first acknowledge the damage that we're doing to our brothers and sisters, acknowledge their humanity as any other person in the community, and I think from there start having these discussions with them involved.
Just because we only have like a minute left, so can we just get a closing segment from Noura's team? Would that be possible?
So the one thing I'll say
around creating like a framework. Sorry. As a conclusion, closing statement for people who want to take away how they can be practical about the steps taken when addressing other people with same-sex attraction in the Muslim community.
So I think it is incredibly valuable to come up with something that is practical for those who are suffering. I think the split that I kind of see is those Muslims who are psychologists or may work in trauma or related fields. I think it's important what you're saying, let's see them as people, but then I see a wanting to distance ourselves from that being a sin. And I don't want to categorize anyone as just their sin, but when I'm specifically talking about, or when we're talking about someone who is gay and who identifies themselves as gay, then they are identifying with a sin. If it's a person with a same-sex attraction, that's... To identify oneself as a sin, I couldn't answer that question. Okay. Okay, so... Right, so if someone was suffering from alcoholism, said, I'm an alcoholic, and accepting that for themselves, then yes, I think it would be a sin to accept oneself as a sinner, because we are all sinners, but we don't say, my sin is okay, right? So when we're talking about, well, we don't accept these people in the masjid, well, who are we talking about? Someone who's waving a rainbow flag, yeah, that would be very problematic to come into this space and say, we demand acceptance. Someone who is suffering and says, this is my problem, please help me, absolutely they should be welcome. So I think the bridge really needs to be closed between those who are more focused on, yes, these are people and they're dealing with trauma, let's deal with that first, and those who say, okay, but here's the law and here's how we deal with not just the sin, but also that community and how aggressive they can be in promoting their ideas. So for me, that needs to sort of be the first bridge. And, I wish that people who were Muslim psychologists, I know this is a horrible word to throw out, and yes, people say it does not work, this idea of conversion therapy. I'm not saying that works, I'm not saying that's what we should do, but I'm saying that if we are believers and we're saying people are suffering, can we come up with a program, Muslim practicing psychologists, to help people who are suffering from whether it's thoughts or from practicing that act you don't want to?
So I'm understanding on a professional level, creating that framework with psychologists and possibly even mashayikh to address this as perhaps a mental health issue, or is it a...
I just wanted to respond. I just wanted to really clarify what I had said. By no means was I only referring to same-sex attraction, people, suffering with same-sex attraction. I was actually, like that division I gave you was for all of us to ponder upon, because we do seem to have a bit of a problem in work, navigating between, when we do sins, we have a problem with navigating like the level of our sins that we do. All right. So I really want to clarify that so that people don't feel that I was only singling out, same-sex attraction, people with same-sex attraction. And I'm actually here to help people as much as I can who are going through this. I'm happy for anyone to contact me privately after this as well. But you want to ask about what we can do as a community. I just want to say one thing: please don't push brothers or sisters who've got this problem and think that, push them into getting married thinking that that's going to solve their problem. Please don't do that. Also, I think that it's very important that our mashayikh, because religious leaders do tend to be people's first point of reference. So I think it's very important that people are able to feel safe when they happen to open up and ask a question to religious leaders, and not, like I said, not judge them. And if you yourself, if someone opened up to you, know that the fact that they've opened up to you, you should feel privileged that someone trusted you enough to open up to you. Please don't distance yourself. Realize I tried to highlight some of the things, some of the pressures that, our sisters and brothers are going through. I'd like you to think about that next time if someone happened to open up to you. Please consider, your reaction when they open up to you and how you can support them, and realize they are really going through some hard times, especially when, as I said, the LGBT community are just screaming at them, telling them just give in, go ahead and live that lifestyle and just, give it all up. You know what I mean? That's really a difficult situation to be in. Okay, I'll just leave it there. I don't want to...
So we're going to wrap it up now, just to understand that these panelists, they all have different experiences to bring to this conversation. And alhamdulillah, this is the first conversation of many to be had. It's very as important, as you can see, that this issue is discussed. It has a lot of controversy around it, but the fact that we're able to have a panel of speakers with different experience addressing it is a big step in the right direction, alhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us on to the right path and allow us to, deal with this situation when it comes to us, with others, within ourselves, in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because at the end of the day, we are all, as you said, sinners. We are all slaves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the end of the day, we are all just trying to improve our relationship with Allah and overcome obstacles that come in our way. So Jazakumullah khair for this very taboo topic being discussed with amazing panelists, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us more opportunities to address it.
لا يزال الخير حيا لا يزال إن في الدنيا سلام